We have here a new article at the website mercuriouspoliticus.wordpress.com, and it's entitled Ghost in the Machine, and it's written by Mercurius Politicus. And he begins a slightly belated Halloween post. I was 14 when the first season of The X-Files was broadcast on UK television. This was the perfect age to become obsessed with the program's mix of aliens, ghosts, and conspiracy theories. Like Fox Mulder, I wanted to believe. The series sparked an obsession that made me an eager viewer of the other mostly awful programs which tried to cash in on the 1990s vogue for the paranormal. Amongst the most awful was a BBC series. It may have been the one presented by Carol Verderman, although I can't recall for certain, which was a ragbag of strange but true stories presented through dramatic reconstructions. I can remember very little about it, save for one episode that has always stayed with me. It told the story of a man in the early 1980s who found that his BBC microcomputer had become a conduit through which he could communicate with a man from the 16th century. The latter was mystified by the box of lights which had appeared in his house and accused the computer owner of witchcraft. Gradually, however, as the two carried on their electronic conversations, a more trusting relationship developed. The program concluded by stating that archival research supposedly revealed that the 16th century man had actually existed, and that is true, and that expert linguists had concluded that the dialect and vocabulary he used was authentic to the period. A few weeks ago, 15 years on, a memory of this story popped back into my head for some reason. Some quick Googling revealed that other people remembered it too, and that the man in question, Ken Webster, had written a book about his experience called The Vertical Plane. Intrigued, I ordered a second-hand copy and spent a happy afternoon reacquainting myself with the story. The book badges itself as a unique supernatural detective story, and one look at the cover gave an early warning that it was published by HarperCollins' Occult Division. You may or may not be relieved to know that this isn't going to be a post about whether Webster's account is true. Instead, I thought it might be interesting to consider Webster's book as a cultural artifact in its own right. Webster's book has quite a lot going on beneath the surface, which will perhaps be of interest to early modernists who study texts and different forms they can take. So this post does two things. First, it summarizes the story Webster sets out in his book. Secondly, it looks at how Webster tells this story, and how his own text and narrative link to early modern ideas about text and narratives. Larry Sharp, thank you for the super chat. Larry says, everyone have a good and blessed night. Bless you too, Lawrence. I appreciate it. Thank you. Webster's story starts in the autumn of 1984, in the village of Dodleston, near to the English border with Wales. He is living in Meadow Cottage, an 18th century house in the middle of the village, with his girlfriend Debbie and friend Nick. Webster borrows a BBC microcomputer from the school at which he teaches, so that Nick can use the word processor to write comedy sketches. All three are alarmed when files start appearing on the computer with messages in an archaic form of English, signed with the initials LW. The messages are accompanied by various poltergeist phenomena, such as objects being moved or piled in particular formations. LW gradually reveals himself as Lucas Wainman, living in a house on the site of Meadow Cottage during Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine Parr. In other words, at some point between 1543 and 1547. He kept various livestock on the land around his house. He had been married with a son, but both wife and child died of the plague in 1517. He had studied at Brasenose College in Oxford and knew Erasmus, having met him three times in all. A friend of Lucas's then starts communicating. It turns out that Lucas has been arrested and is being held by the local sheriff, Sir Thomas Falshurst, due to his communications with the light box, as Lucas calls it, in his house back in the 1500s. The friend also reveals that Lucas is a pseudonym. Lucas is then released and held under house arrest, resuming communication and confessing how scared he is of the fate that could await him. He also reveals that the light box was brought to his house by someone called One from the year 2109. Lucas had been under the impression that Webster was also from 2109, until Ken told him that he was living in 1985. An unnamed contact from 2109 then starts leaving impenetrable messages on the BBC computer, saying that the events they are experiencing have a wider purpose. In the meantime, Webster and his friends try to think of a way to save Lucas's life. He was in danger of being accused of witchcraft, I guess, because of the light box. They remember a chance reference by Lucas to Henry Mann, Dean of Cheshire, and they find information in the present that Mann had in 1533 communicated with Elizabeth Barton, the so-called Maid of Kent. Barton was a Catholic nun who had made prophecies critical of Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn, and who was executed as a result the following year. Webster gave this information to Lucas to use as a bargaining chip with the sheriff. However, it does not work, and Lucas goes on trial regardless. But he is kept alive to keep the light box working. During this period, Thomas Falshurst begins to use the box himself to communicate with Webster, and it emerges that events are happening in the exact year of 1546. Communication is then reestablished with Lucas. But with further intervention and inscrutable comments from 2109, Webster and Lucas begin to suspect that 2109 is interfering with their messages. And they develop a system where Lucas starts communicating with paper and charcoal, left out for him in the present. Lucas, meanwhile, is able somehow to see and hear Webster from the past. One of the themes which emerges most strongly from the vertical planes narrative is the instability of texts. Webster's ghost is a textual ghost. Although Hardin seems to be able to see and hear what is happening in the present, Webster himself never sees Hardin, although his girlfriend Debbie sees him in her dreams on several occasions. Instead, he primarily interacts with Hardin through various forms of textual communication, none of which the reader can rely on. And here's 3 bullet points. Through the letters on Webster's computer monitor. Some of these, Webster never knows which, are altered in subtle ways by the group 2109. Others are deleted by mistake, meaning that Webster has to summarize what he can recollect of them. Number 2, through printed copies of those same letters, a number of these are also subsequently lost. And again, we rely on Webster's memory for them, for the content of his narrative. And number 3, through manuscript notes, which Hardin scratches onto surfaces in the present-day Meadow Cottage or writes on scraps of paper and appear in the present day. The materiality of these notes inclines Webster to place most faith in them, even though they are often the shortest and most cryptic of Hardin's statements. Hardin communicates through different identities, directly as Lucas Wainman, then as Thomas Hardin, and second-hand through an unnamed friend, and through the sheriff, Thomas Fowlshurst. He also sets traps for Webster in an attempt to assess whether he is really from the future. For example, he claims to have done his degree at Jesus College, Oxford, which at that time did not exist. Anyone from the future, Hardin reasons, would surely know that there is no such thing as Jesus College, and that it is nonsensical to claim to have studied there. Meanwhile, Webster sees this as a mistake, which could point to the presence of a hoaxer.